What is Space Invaders actually about? At first glance, this might seem like a really simple question. The answer's in the name. It's a game about invaders from outer space trying to take over the world. It's a simple story, fitting of a similarly simple arcade game. However, I believe that there's more going on narratively in Space Invaders than this surface-level examination would suggest. In fact, I would argue that Space Invaders is an incredibly ambiguous tale, with unclear lines of morality stemming from its minimalistic approach to storytelling. Exploring Space Invaders from a narrative perspective shows that wherever you might look in games, you will find stories, and thinking about them can be a vibrant and engaging experience for anyone curious enough to do so. My readings of Space Invaders are drawn from the game's opening moments. Attract screens were an important part of arcade design. When an arcade cabinet wasn't in use, the Attract screen would display a game's high score, as well as showing off gameplay and narrative. The idea was that these things would draw in new players with a preview of the fun to be had, and the scores they'd have to beat to have their name immortalized. Hence the term Attract screen. Like pretty much every other arcade game, Space Invaders Attract mode had gameplay demos, but for the purposes of this narrative analysis, I mostly care about the informational screens. On the tutorial screen where players learn the point values of each alien, the Y in the word play is initially upside down, but an invader comes along and addresses the error. Another screen spells coin, but with 2 C's. Again, one of the invaders comes along and fixes the issue. From these screens, we can glean a few important pieces of information. Firstly, we know that the invaders have an understanding of the conventions of the human language, and secondly, we know that they have a desire to fix typos and errors in human text. These 2 pieces of information are some of the only things we know about the invaders. While actually playing Space Invaders, we can understand a bit of the behavior of the aliens, that they slowly progress towards the Earth, that they have the ability to attack with some sort of weapon, and that the fewer there are, the faster they can move. However, their in-game behavior doesn't really tell us much about why they are invading. The Attract screens are some of the few glimpses we have into the motivations driving the events of the game. Perhaps these invaders aren't coming because they want to control the Earth or destroy it, but rather because they want to come fix our typos. Us Earthlings are pretty prone to making all sorts of typographical errors. Sensing an aura of misspelled words, perhaps the invaders have come to address the issue, in one way or another. Going purely on what is depicted in the game, the broader picture of Space Invaders is incomplete. We know that some sort of invader is coming from space, and that they attack the player character, but that point of view is limited to the moment-to-moment struggle in the trenches, and that leaves many questions unanswered. What are the Space Invaders? What do they want? What is the player character supposed to represent? In the context of Space Invaders, what does a game over mean? The incomplete depiction of the invasion's context might be criticized by some as a lacking story. However, I would argue that it is precisely this incompleteness that makes Space Invaders' story so interesting. Instead of laying out another simplistic narrative along clear-cut lines of morality, the existing narrative elements suggest a bigger picture that leaves space for the players to navigate a more interesting set of narrative complexities. For instance, let's examine the narrative assumption that the Space Invaders are the bad guys. Perhaps the invaders are coming with benevolent intentions. After all, having an editor double-check my work is extremely helpful, and perhaps the invaders are merely coming to help humanity. Unfortunately for the aliens, humanity can have a very itchy trigger finger, and I have no doubt that a radar operator detecting organized patterns of unidentified flying objects would cause panic among military institutions, potentially causing humanity to strike out against the unknown aviators. The military that initially launched the strikes against the Space Invaders might not even know that they're shooting at aliens, instead assuming that the radar patterns are terrestrial military activity. In real life, on multiple occasions, we've come close to starting nuclear war for absurd errors, like sensors misreading moonrises as nuclear attacks, or because a technician accidentally inserted a wargame training tape into an operational computer. If you read about our history of nuclear close calls, a preemptive strike against an unknown flight formation seems entirely plausible. Or who knows, maybe the game's military does know that the flying objects are aliens, but paranoia causes them to fire anyway. After being attacked, perhaps the Space Invaders chose to fight back against our vicious weaponry. Critics of this interpretation might argue that if these aliens were truly so benevolent, they wouldn't be shooting at us at all. Firstly, it's important to remember that our insight into the invasion comes from only a single defensive outpost, and that it's entirely possible that some of the fighting has happened before the game's events. There's an entire discussion to be had about the ethics of the invaders firing back after being attacked by military installations. Secondly, the ambiguity surrounding the player's avatar is worth considering. The in-game sprite is not incredibly detailed, so it's not clear if the player's vehicle is piloted by a human, though I'd make the case that the vessel is unmanned. Art from the cabinet's monitor depicts a sort of missile turret. No gunner is visible, and it's entirely possible that it is operated via remote control. Perhaps the Space Invaders have no qualms with destroying military hardware, but would actually oppose to killing an intelligent creature. Or maybe they would feel justified in killing a human that is actively destroying their brethren. You might argue against this line of reasoning by pointing out that Space Invaders is a game that can be lost, implying, on some level, malevolence from the invaders. Does a game over not imply bad things? Perhaps, but again, the exact nature of what a game over means in the context of Space Invaders is up for debate. We are never shown charred remains of society, or any images that one would usually associate with the aftermath of a lost alien invasion. Yes, the term game over has come to signify more than its literal meaning, that the game is finished, to take on a negative connotation. The game is over, and the world will now be destroyed. However, we aren't shown exactly what a game over means in the context of Space Invaders, so its precise implication entirely depends on the rest of our narrative interpretation. If you assume that the game is just a standard alien invasion, then game over implies that the world has been taken over. If one assumes that the aliens are benevolent, game over could merely mean that the fighting has come to an end, that the aliens have arrived, and we have realized that they meant us no harm. Regardless, the implications of game over entirely depend on the narrative assumptions that the player makes about the rest of the game's contents. The benevolent alien reading recasts the game's actions in decidedly tragic terms. An alien race finds humanity and comes to help us avoid typos, like some sort of extraterrestrial tutor. For their act of kindness, the invaders are greeted by the paranoia and xenophobia of Earth's governing bodies and their well-funded militaries. Maybe an understanding could be reached, but only after entirely unnecessary bloodshed. Dehumanization is an all-too-common tactic used by proponents of war. Simply by casting a group as a, quote, invader, and rhetorically positioning them as an other, governments have been able to commit atrocities against innocent people. Considering this fact, the name Space Invaders takes on a whole new meaning. Perhaps, if the player takes time to consider the aliens not as invaders, but as just another species in the cosmic ballet of life, a miraculous meaning of two societies formed light years apart, they might see a sense of tragedy in the fact that the first thing that we decided to do upon meeting these aliens was to blow them up. This is a reading that speaks to how human governments can often jump into unnecessary wars, especially when they contextualize the opposing side as an enemy or alien, as if warfare against an unknown foe is more justified. Of course, this is not the only reading of Space Invaders one could take. If you dislike the reading of the aliens as potential benefactors of humanity, there are other possibilities to consider. After all, we aren't even sure that these aliens are biological. The now iconic pixelated enemies don't really give us much detail to know exactly what these aliens are. Imagine a group of aliens light years away from Earth. These aliens probably have languages of their own, and assuming that their technology is advanced enough, they might also invent a spell-checking tool for their word processors. Eventually, these aliens might also invent advanced artificial intelligences that are capable of automatically addressing lexical errors. In fact, let's say that these aliens create a supercomputer and give it one simple task: fix all typos. Unknowingly, this request could spell their doom. The 2017 video game Universal Paperclips is about an AI tasked with making paperclips. For the player, this means engaging in clicker gameplay that represents the act of making paperclips. Over time, the player's AI gains access to new functions that lets it create even more paperclips, until eventually it turns to the stars to fuel its paperclip-producing prime directive. The idea is that if we aren't careful about the sorts of goals that we give to AIs, it will lead to disastrous, unintended results. Theoretically, a similar misalignment of values could happen with a super-intelligent spell-checking machine. Such a construct might conclude that the best way to fix all typos is to destroy them at their source, which is to say, destroying anything capable of making an error while writing. If a superintelligence had access to military installations, production facilities, economic institutions, and those of governments, it could enforce typo compliance with a steel fist. Perhaps the superintelligence destroys all intelligent life on its planet of origins to prevent typos. But even after it has accomplished this, it might still try to follow its prime directive. Destroy all typos includes errors in all languages, including those of extraterrestrial origins. Consuming its home planet for resources, the superintelligence could produce probes that scan exoplanets for signs of intelligent life, and, upon discovery, it could study their language to understand what does or does not count as an error. Upon discovery and intuition of a new language, the superintelligence would deploy its fleet of grammatical enforcement, which is where we catch up to the events of Space Invaders. Compared to the tragic bent of the previous interpretation, this reading is more of a philosophical cautionary tale about the power of a superintelligence with a poorly considered guiding objective, and the damage it could do not only to its creators, but the rest of the universe. Fighting the forces of a cosmically powerful spell checker becomes an act of futility, as vulnerable as combating the forces of an expansive paperclip generator. In the end, all of the quirks and mistakes of our language would be solved, but there would be nobody left to appreciate it. Even if you don't buy into the full superintelligence interpretation, the invaders could alternatively be a literal contingent of grammar fascists who have come to impose an authoritarian status quo of iron-fisted language on Earth's population. Ultimately, the one thing that remains consistent between all of these readings is that aliens are coming to Earth, and that they want to fix typos. Because of the game's ambiguity about all of its elements, the variety of possible explanations for the game's events are quite extensive. During the production of this video, I was talking about my Space Invaders readings with my friend Ali Meowie, and she proposed an entirely new reading that I hadn't considered. Taking inspiration from a Twilight Zone episode, Ali suggested that maybe the invaders were capable of understanding English because they're human, and it's actually the aliens whose home planet is being invaded. There are more readings than I had even initially considered. It is the ambiguity of Space Invaders that makes it such a fascinating narrative to think about, and not just in some weird, but hey, that's just a theory sort of way. Games are sometimes discussed as the interactive medium. Players have the power to make choices that can impact how the game progresses. It is true that games can leverage interactivity in ways that prior mediums struggled to. However, I think it's also important to remember that, in ideal situations, more traditional media also embraced its own sort of interaction. Of particular note is reader response theory, a school of literary analysis that emphasizes the reader as an active participant in the act of producing meaning. According to reader response theory, a work's meaning isn't encoded in the text like a puzzle to be solved, but rather it is derived from the reader's own interpretation of a text. To theorists like Wolfgang Iser and Stanley Fish, who helped develop reader response theory, texts weren't merely a set of symbols that were intended to be ciphered in one specific, author-intended way. Rather, they acknowledged that readers would be bringing their own experiences to the table, and that texts would ask readers to engage with them beyond mere consumption in order to really understand it. As Iser succinctly explains, central to the reading of every literary work is the interaction between its structure and its recipient. Yes, games are interactive, but games cannot claim sole ownership over interactivity. While Iser was specifically writing about books, his ideas about the interaction between the text and the reader could be applied on the stage, in film, with paintings, and in games. According to Iser, within a text, gaps will inherently arise out of the fact that people have different experiences from one another, and that interpretation is a tool that is used to create understanding between disparate things. Driven by different social conventions, histories, and knowledge bases, the ways in which people construct their own meanings will differ in how they adopt their own relationship with a text. As a bisexual cis man, my relationship with a book like Giovanni's Room will be altered by those experiences in a way that it wouldn't be for a straight reader. Additionally, texts will often be constructed from strings of sequences, images, and patterns, though the text cannot explicitly comment on the entirety of how different parts of the sequence relate to each other. And even if it could, laboriously explaining literally everything would be a tedious and self-sabotaging process that robs readers of a chance to fill in these gaps for themselves. Within the framework of reader response theory, the reader is responsible for making an active effort to interact with the text, in order to contextualize their own experiences and find some sort of meaning. A text like Space Invaders certainly leaves a lot for the player to respond to. The hardware of the time did not allow for many extraneous details, so much of the game's narrative context is left up to implication. Because of the massive success of Space Invaders, Taito would produce several games that pushed the series in different directions. Many of these Space Invaders games were made on much more advanced hardware, and as a result, some of the original game's ambiguity was lost. Consider Space Raiders, or as it is known in Europe, Space Invaders Invasion Day. Invasion Day is a sort of reboot of Space Invaders, but with cutscenes and dramatic voice acting. Earth is infested with bugs, goo monsters, and all sorts of nasty aliens, which are here to cause chaos and destruction across the globe. It's the sort of standard alien invasion story that has been done many times before, and in this case, it doesn't do anything with the setup that you haven't seen before. There are aliens that are bad and want to destroy everything, and heroic humans who are standing up to the invaders. The game doesn't really do much interesting with the tropes. One of the protagonists is looking for their missing fiancé, but her pain and loss isn't explored or understood beyond its functional utility in the plot as a motivation to drive the protagonist forward. The story is seen at a higher resolution, but it's a high-def, beige wall of tired, shallowed tropes. Having an, on paper, more fleshed-out story isn't inherently more engaging, especially if those additional details don't create interesting gaps for the players to think about.
Whew! Those monsters! Why? Why did they do this? Here they come!
Space Invaders doesn't show many details, but the elements that are present give a grounding to the game's events. From that starting point, the player must make assumptions about what is going on. Even if the player accepts the standard alien invasion premise, they're still asked to imagine what that looks like, and two people could imagine very different alien invasions. And for those that want to think outside of the parameters of the most common explanations, there is much fun to be had. The important thing is that in the absence of precise explanations, players must exert a bit of effort to fill in the gaps within a text, an activity which in itself inspires deeper and more meaningful thoughts. While the conclusions the player comes to can be profound and interesting, the act of reaching those answers is part of why those answers feel meaningful. The poem Ozymandias could have just directly said, "I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 'Everything that exists is going to fall from prominence, decay, and everything will eventually be forgotten by the sands of time, even those things that are very powerful.'" And on one level, that does sort of mean the same thing as the original, but it's a truth made hollow and dull in its blunt delivery. There's no thought or process for the reader to come to understand the poem on their own terms and grapple with that meaning themselves. To be clear, I don't feel that more advanced hardware inherently leads to shallower stories. In fact, more powerful computers have given storytellers more tools with which to construct their stories, and when used skillfully, those tools can make game worlds that inspire deep thought in players. Eco is an incredibly understated game that does a great job at leveraging the power of the PlayStation 2 in a way that suggests more than it actually shows. There are lots of mysterious places, objects, and people throughout the game, but the exact relationship between these elements is hazy, leaving room for the players to question these aspects. What is the purpose of this gigantic fortress? Who is Yorda, and what is her relationship to the Queen? What are these shadow creatures? These questions don't just arise out of thin air, but rather come from the game's deliberate construction. Eco is filled with evocative images that are juxtaposed, with their reactions to each other providing insight, but never spelling things out entirely. The player is left room to think about the relationship of these things for themselves, and thus can come to a wide variety of fascinating conclusions. As games like Eco show, the progression of technology doesn't need to mean the death of mystery. Even as games became more sophisticated, they never could leave ambiguity behind entirely. In fact, games eventually began leaning into ambiguous gaps in far greater ways. If you dare to look closely, games are filled with unanswered questions and personal insights. These questions can draw players beyond the literal, stated reality of games into a world of more meaningful examinations. The point is not to just throw out theories for the sake of theorizing, but to consider the unstated themes communicated by the art. For the inquisitive, the medium is awash with narrative potential for players to unearth. If a game as unassuming as Space Invaders could suggest so much narrative possibility, how many other unassuming titles are out there with interesting narrative aspects to consider? What does the chaotic way that magic works in Noita say about the nature of those who choose to wield it? What is the purpose of endless expansion in Factorio? Is Pikmin a war game? And what does the answer to that question say about the strategy genre more broadly? These questions arise from the imagery and mechanics of these games to draw connections to other games and broader subjects outside of gaming entirely. As a player, I think it's valuable to stay inquisitive and curious about the world, and to keep asking questions about the things around me. After noticing the attract mode spelling details, I considered its implications, and found myself constructing fascinating readings of Space Invaders. However, this inquisitiveness isn't just applicable to Space Invaders. I believe that exploring unstated questions in games can be a refreshing and powerful lens to view the medium through. Personally, I think it's beautiful that even though humans are responsible for creating these virtual playgrounds, they are capable of taking on a life of their own and embodying experiences and ideas that the designers could have never anticipated or expected. It speaks to the power of interactivity. Though everyone might have the same copy of a game, everyone's paths to understand a game will diverge, driven by their own experiences, insights, and the whims of their own curiosity. Even for a game as simple as Space Invaders, there are so many possibilities. There's no such thing as a game without a story, and wherever narrative exists, readings can flourish. More than presenting my own ideas about what Space Invaders means, I ultimately care more about encouraging people to give thought to the narratives of games that aren't known for their stories. I can't guarantee that you will always find something, but you might be surprised at what you can find if you dare to look.